Some of these traps were gun booby traps. The officer that had yelled for everyone.
Hello my loves, so welcome back to my channel. Today we're gonna react to MrBallen, the Texas Cat Lady House of Horrors. Alright, so let's get into this. DIY. Ooh, doesn't sound good at all.
Located on the far northern tip of Maine, right on the border of Canada, lies a small rural town called Van Buren. Van Buren is home to about 2,000 people who, for the most part, have lived in Maine for their entire lives, and they tend
I
to
think
be
it looks like a
very
beautiful,
rugged and
you know,
very competent
city.
people.
I
But
really
unless
like
you
it.
live in Van Buren or know someone in Van Buren or have family out there, there's no reason you would have heard of this particular town. Nothing really happens in this town, at least nothing that makes headlines. However, that would change. In 2019, Van Buren made international headlines because of one man, Ronald Sear. As a young man in the 1950s, Ronald Sear joined the Air Force and fought in the Korean War. And then after he got out of the military, he moved back to his hometown of Van Buren, Maine, and he moved into a very modest two-story home right near town. And for a little while, he just kind of floated about, didn't really have a direction in life. But eventually, because of his love for working with his hands and his general skill at working with his hands and building things, he started a small but successful tool-selling company that he ran right out of his shed on his property. Fast forward to 2019,
that's very cool.
Ronald Sear at that time was 65 years old, and he still lived in the same property right near town in Van Buren. However, he now lived alone, and he still ran this tool-selling business right out of his work shed. And for Ronald, this was enough. He was very content with his life. He was very happy. But that year, he would face a crisis. One bright, sunny morning in the summer of that year, Ronald left his house and he walked over to his shed. He went inside, and right away he noticed something. Ronald kept all these bins inside of his shed that were full of all of the different tools that he would sell. And because he was in there all the time, either literally selling tools or tinkering with whatever it was he was building himself,
he would know
he
where
was very
everything
aware
was.
of how full each of these bins were. And anytime they got low, he would order more so he had enough supply
So
to
he
sell.
knew.
And so he went into his shed this morning and he noticed right away that a couple of the bins appeared to be a little bit lower than he remembered. And right away, Ronald is thinking, you know, did I forget to order supplies to fill these bins up?
Did somebody break
forget
in?
to do that? But he's thinking to himself, you know, I am meticulous in making sure my inventory is full at all times. I've been doing this for decades, and so it can't be me. You know, maybe I took the tools and I brought them into my house and I've left them in there, or maybe they're in my truck. And so Ronald, believing there's a totally logical explanation for this, would leave his shed and he would search his property, but he can't find these tools anywhere. And so he began calling his family and his friends to see if, you know, maybe they had come by and borrowed some of these tools, or maybe they knew what had happened to them. But everyone he spoke to said, no, I have no idea. And so by that afternoon, Ronald had found himself back inside of his work shed looking around, thinking to himself, have I been robbed? It was the only logical thing.
That's what I was thinking in the beginning.
This loss. And so Ronald drove to the police station and he spoke to police and he explained what happened. But unfortunately, the police's reaction to what he was telling them was not exactly what he wanted. They basically assumed that, you know, he just had miscounted, that in reality the tools were either still in the shed and he just forgot how many were supposed to be in there, or he had just kind of lost them in his property somewhere. They were bound to turn up. So the police told him, look, Ronald, go back and search your property. I'm sure they're there.
The police was like, look, Ronald, we don't give a fuck. I mean, yo, God. They could have at least, you know, man.
And if you get some proof that someone actually stole from you, then come back to us. And so Ronald was really annoyed by this. He wanted them to take this seriously, but he could tell they just were not going to. And so Ronald drove back to his house, he went inside, he hopped on his computer, and he began researching.
Please make sure to hit the subscribe button so we can get to 1K. That would make me really happy, guys.
Researching what other homeowners did to protect themselves from things like theft. And one of the things he came across was setting up tripwires all around the perimeter of your property. Basically, you take these thin wires and you stretch them out very tight, very low to the ground, and you anchor them on each side, and then on the wire itself you hang little bells. And so in theory, if an intruder were to walk onto your property,
you would hear like the little bells,
not see the tripwires on the ground, and they would kick them, and that would cause the bells to ring, thereby alerting the homeowner of their presence. Ronald loved this.
Imagine that the poor guy hears this one night and he goes into the shed and nobody's there. Ooh. Maybe the rats are stealing something, you know?
So he went out and he set up tripwires all around his property. But over the next several days, after these wires were stood up, none of the wires made any sound,
The rats
and
are
still
smart.
more tools continued to go missing. This was also in spite of the fact that his shed was locked at night. And so Ronald's thinking to himself, whoever's doing this is clearly watching me and kind of monitoring what I'm doing. They must be aware of the tripwires, and they must be sneaking into the shed, you know, at some time that I have the doors unlocked. I mean, this is a professional thief. And so as Ronald is thinking about this master thief that is targeting him, he has this sudden fear that if he can't stop this person from breaking into his shed and taking his tools, how can he possibly protect himself against this person breaking into his home and stealing things from in there, which included all of his cash and many other valuables. And so Ronald became very fearful,
that's the big
and
question.
decided the
How
only
can
thing
he
he
stop
could do
him?
was really beef up his home security system. And so he hopped back online and he began Googling other ways to protect your property. And after discovering a number of really effective techniques, he got to work. He began building all these home defense systems and placing them all around his property. And after all of these kind of DIY security measures were put up, the theft of his tools stopped. And in Ronald's mind, that validated that his defense system had worked. He was effectively preventing theft. But this would not be the end of his troubles. Fast forward to Thanksgiving that year, so November 28th, and the Van Buren police got a very frantic phone call from Ronald. He was totally hysterical, he wasn't really making sense, and the police, they tried to understand what was going on, but all they could get from Ronald was that he was requesting police to come to his residence immediately. And so the police, they hang up and they're thinking, okay, you know, we know Ronald was dealing with a potential thief. Maybe
that
he
was
literally
it.
caught the thief red-handed, and he wants us to come and arrest this person, and who knows, maybe they're fighting at his residence right now. And so the police speed over to Ronald's house, they pull into his driveway, and at first glance, nothing looks out of the ordinary. Ronald's truck is in the driveway, and there's no obvious signs of a disturbance, but they notice the front door to Ronald's house is wide open. And so the police park their cars in Ronald's driveway, they get out and they run up onto the front porch, and they're standing in front of this open door, and they look down and they can see there's a very obvious blood trail starting from the front of Ronald's house, going straight back down a hallway that looped around to the left and out of sight. And so right away, the police are yelling into the house, Ronald, are you okay? What's going on? And somewhere deep inside of the house, they hear what sounds like Ronald make a kind of guttural sound. And so immediately this tips the police that more than likely Ronald has been hurt, and he likely is the one who made this blood trail. And so the police draw their guns and they go inside of Ronald's house, not really sure what they're going to find. They don't know if there's some intruder or attacker or someone in here that's harmed Ronald, but they make their way down this hall following the blood trail. They turn the corner,
Call the ambulance.
Sitting at the end of the blood trail is Ronald. He's sitting down with his back to some cabinets in the kitchen, and he's clutching his midsection. He is covered in blood. He's completely pale. And so right away, the officers call in backup, but then as a security measure, they search the rest of the first floor to make sure there is no other person here. There was no one on the first floor. They went to the second floor. They peeked around up there. They didn't see anyone. So they rushed back down to Ronald, who's still just sitting there, and they begin administering first aid, and they're trying to get him to explain what happened. How did you get hurt? But Ronald is clearly in shock. He's kind of in a daze. He's not making sense. And then by the time the paramedics showed up, just a couple of minutes later, Ronald had slipped into unconsciousness. When Ronald was wheeled out of the house, the responding officers and the backup officers, who by now had arrived, decided to search the rest of Ronald's house to see if there was some clue as to what had happened. And so they began searching in the kitchen, looking around, but
and
there wasn't
also the
anything
place
that
where
stood
he
out to
worked,
them.
like
And then
search
they
that
began
too.
walking around towards the living room, and when they got into the living room, one of the officers suddenly screamed to everyone inside to stop where they were, stop moving. It would turn out Ronald...
Please don't tell me that this man built thing that explodes, you know. So maybe he used some, I don't know, pieces of metal or something. I don't think you should do that, because maybe if you're a specialist, because you never know how that thing would blow up. I mean, you get a soda from your supermarket, you come home and you're running and you open that thing and it just blows up in your face.
as part of his very beefed up home security system, had installed various booby traps all around his property, including inside of his house. And some of these traps were gun booby traps. The officer that had yelled for everyone to stop
I was not expecting
had spotted one of these traps. He saw a handgun anchored to the ceiling aimed at the front door, and there was a string attached to the trigger that was also then attached to the doorknob of the front door. And so if this trap were live and some person opened the front door, it would activate this trap, causing the gun to shoot them. And so clearly Ronald had accidentally left this particular booby trap on, and he had accidentally activated it, shooting himself. And so after the officer...
Jesus Christ, like, oh my God. Like, imagine it was one of his family members and they were just like, yeah, I just didn't want to tell you because I didn't want you to, you know, get mad at me. Yo, I don't understand who was stealing from him. And you know, booby traps are good, but not inside of your house, because sometimes you get so worked up with your own work, with your own housework, and you forget. Oh, dear God, dear God.
Sees this gun anchored to the ceiling. He tells everyone, and they begin looking up and just looking around to see if there are other traps. And amazingly, there are. In other doorways, just from where they're standing, they can see the barrels of guns pointing down that are obvious booby traps. In their haste to get in there and figure out what was going on, they hadn't noticed all of these guns in the ceiling, and so it was just kind of a miracle that none of the other traps had been set off. Ronald would be rushed to the hospital that night, but he would pass away from his wound. His death would be ruled an accident, and to this day, we don't know if he really was dealing with a professional thief that was stealing his tools, or if it was just a figment of his imagination.
I think that we should give the man the props for actually trying his best to defend himself from this thief. And I don't want people to say, oh, maybe, you know, since he was an older guy. No, no, no. When you have a thief, you have a thief, all right? And sometimes, even if it's weird, for example, I have makeup and I organize it a certain way, and you know, sometimes if I don't know, it just, what I'm trying to say is that when you work with something such a long time, for such a long time, you know where everything is, you know the quantity of it, because if you also love what you do, it is impossible to forget when you put that where you put it. No, like, it is impossible. I think that he really had somebody that was, you know, stealing from him. I don't know who it was, and it's just a tragedy the way it ended. But I don't want people to say, no, that didn't happen to him. That 100% happened to him. It's just that, you know, the police didn't want to get involved because, you know, I don't know what to say. I don't know the cause of it. Like, they didn't want to get involved, and so, you know, he had to take matters in his own hands, and, you know, it ended how it ended.
Mary Cerruti had a difficult childhood. Growing up in the 1950s and early 1960s in Houston, Texas, Mary's family barely had enough money to get by. And then by the time Mary was 21, both of her parents had passed away, leaving her with nothing. After their deaths, Mary kind of bounced around Houston, going from one low-paying job to the next. And then eventually she met a man that she fell madly in love with, and they got married, but unfortunately that marriage would end in divorce. After Mary got over that heartbreak, she would meet another man who she would also fall in love with, and they would get married too, but like her first marriage, this one also ended in divorce. At this point, Mary was so devastated by yet another heartbreak that she just kind of accepted that she was not gonna get married again. She was not gonna have a family of her own. But she didn't let this get her down. Instead, she kind of embraced her life as a loner. Fast forward to 2015, and Mary was 61 years old, and she was still living alone. She lived in a small home in a Houston neighborhood. This neighborhood, over the last several decades, had really begun to grow. Lots of new apartment complexes were being built all the time, and in fact, one of the apartment developers had approached Mary and offered to buy her house so they could build over her land, but she had refused because she loved her house. She did not want to sell it. It didn't matter what they offered her. And so she was the only house in this long stretch of apartment buildings that didn't sell. But Mary kind of liked it. She wrote in her diary that Her bungalow was like a castle, and all these apartment buildings all around her were her castle walls. Mary didn't really have much contact with other people. She didn't have a consistent job, so she didn't have relationships with coworkers. She didn't have much contact, if any, with her living family, and she really didn't have any friends, with the exception of one woman who was in town who owned an arts and crafts shop, who Mary would periodically go into town and say hello to. But despite all that, Mary was not lonely. She had lots and lots of cats, and she loved cats. Anytime she saw a stray cat out in the neighborhood,
For example, I just think that there is nothing bad with, wanting to spend more time by yourself. And as she did, she, embraced the fact that she just couldn't find a way to be with somebody else. And I think that, there isn't a good thing or a bad thing that you can do in life, because we all forget that we each have our own lives. We each have our own things that we love to do that we don't love to do, which each and one of us are different and unique in our own ways. And whenever I hear people be like, yeah, by the time you're 20 you should do this, by the time you're 30 you should do this, by the time you're 40 you should do this, by the time of 80 you should die, and I'm thinking, excuse me, but I didn't know you were Jesus. If everybody ever wants to embrace whatever makes them happy, do it. That's what everything is about. And if she actually helped animals, that is even more amazing.
Neighborhood, Mary would get the cat food and water, and then eventually would try to coax the cat to come into her house, and then when it did, she would win the cat's trust, and then she would give it a place to live, and she would feed it and take care of it. And so before long, she had dozens of cats living in the house with her. And so she rarely left the house, if ever. She mostly just stayed in the house with them. In February of that year, one of Mary's neighbors happened to be walking by her property, and they looked over and they saw a stack of mail had grown on her front porch, indicating that Mary had not opened her door to get her mail. And this neighbor also noticed that while Mary's property did tend to get a little bit overgrown with the trees and the grass, it was exceptionally overgrown, like no one was even trying to take care of it. And so this neighbor was concerned that maybe something had happened to Mary, and so they opened up her fence, they walked across the yard, they went up onto the porch, and they knocked on the front door, but it was silent. And so this neighbor kind of leaned over and looked in the window that was just to the left of the door to see if maybe they could look inside, but there was a curtain drawn across that window, so they couldn't see anything. And so the neighbor tried knocking on the door one more time, but again, met with silence. And so after standing there for a minute, the neighbor left the front porch and walked around to the side of the house to see if maybe they could look in one of those windows, but when they went around to the side, those windows were covered with curtains too. So the neighbor walked back to the front of the property and just stood there looking at the house, wondering what they should do. And something told them that something's off, something's wrong, someone needs to make sure
if nobody
Mary
is
okay.
answering and the
Someone
mail
needs
was
to get inside of this house.
piling
so
up.
The neighbor called the Houston police and explained the situation. A few minutes later, the Houston police
Oh, because I
arrived,
thought he
and
was
they
gonna
too
break
went
in,
right
like,
up
no,
onto Mary's
okay.
porch. They knocked on her door. It was met with silence. And
Just
so
break the
after
door.
that, the police talked to one of the other neighbors and got a key that Mary had apparently
Oh,
given them previously.
okay.
And the police went back to Mary's front
Okay,
door.
that's
They
a good
used the
idea
key,
too,
They
yeah.
unlocked the door. They opened it up, and right away they were hit with this horrible smell coming from inside the house. The police pushed the door the rest of the way open, and they stepped inside.
I
and
think that I
yelled
know
out
what
for Mary,
happened.
but it was silent. And then before the police even began walking around looking for her, they looked off to their left and the right inside of the house, and they saw there were all these dead cats all over the ground. And so the Houston police didn't know what happened to Mary, but right away they're thinking, okay, we've seen scenarios like this before where someone who lives alone that no one really checks on dies unexpectedly, and then when they pass away, all of their pets are trapped in the house, they're not getting fed, and so they pass away too. And so the police at this point are fully expecting to find Mary's dead body somewhere in the house. And so they begin walking through the house looking for it. But after searching the house top to bottom, they could not find Mary. And so the police leave Mary's house, and at this point there are people outside gathered because they see the police
Oh my
cars. And so the
God,
police
she did
grabbed a
something
couple
to
of
the
the
cat.
neighbors, and they asked them, do you know anything about this woman? Did she say anything about where she was going? Did you see her leave at any point? And the consensus amongst the neighbors they spoke to was that Mary basically kept to herself. She did not travel. She didn't go anywhere. She mostly just stayed in her house with her cats. And so it was very unlikely that she would have just abandoned the property and abandoned her cats because she loved them so much. And so the police at this point are thinking, okay, she's got to be in this house somewhere. And so the police called a few more officers to the property, and the group went back inside of Mary's house, and they really looked for Mary, thinking that, maybe she slipped into a closet and that's where she passed away, or, maybe she's just hidden somewhere in the house. And so they really kind of ripped the house apart looking for her. But again, there was just nothing. And so after they finally stopped the search without finding Mary, the police contacted Mary's extended family and they asked them the same questions. Did Mary say anything about a trip she was going to take? Is there any reason she would just abandon her property? And they all would say, look, we don't talk to Mary. We don't know where she went. We have no idea. And so for a little while,
the only thing that I can make sense of is that somehow she decided to, for whatever reason, put an end to her loneliness because maybe she still wanted to, I don't know, find someone that she can share her life with. This is supposedly what I think it happened before we know what it really happened. And maybe the cats ate her and she decided to poison herself. So the cats ate her and the cats died too. But cats don't really eat bones. Like, human bones are big. It's impossible. If it was an alligator, yeah, but those are cats. Unless she just left the house and she just wanted to move away, and for whatever reason she poisoned the rest of the cats, or just let them there to die. It just, I don't know, it doesn't make sense.
Well, the Houston police continued to search for Mary in and around Houston, but eventually, after finding nothing, the search kind of stopped, and they reached out to Mary's family and said, if you hear anything else about what happened to Mary, please let us know. Several months later, Mary's house went into foreclosure because no one was making the payments anymore, and the bank put her house up for auction. And a real estate entrepreneur in Houston bought the house up quickly, and after cleaning it out, he put it on the market to be rented out. And for the next couple of years, several tenants lived in Mary's old house, none of them staying for very long. Then in March of 2017, when the property was vacant, this young couple reached out to the landlord and said they were looking to rent, and they were hoping to potentially stay in this property for 2 or 3 years. The landlord was thrilled, and he sent over a lease for them to sign. And then once the couple had signed the lease and the property was theirs, the husband decided to just go over on his own and walk around the property and see what they would need to buy in terms of furnishings. And so the husband arrives at the property, he goes in the front door, he walks around the first floor, and then at some point he decides he wants to go up into the attic to see how much storage space they have. And so he gets underneath the trap door in the ceiling.
Please don't tell me that the police searched up and down the house, but they didn't search the attic. It's like with each story that the police are involved, 1 out of 1 million actually has the police involved and the police tried to do something, and the rest. Like, if the police did not search the attic, honey, how can you even go inside of a house and don't search it up and down? Oh, God.
He grabs the string and he pulls it down, revealing this folded up ladder. He flips down the lower ladder piece and puts it on the ground, and then he began climbing up. Once he got up into the attic, he stayed standing on the ladder and just kind of scanned around, and he saw there really wasn't much up there. There was a couple of metal cages that appeared to have been for pets or something, but it was very dirty and dark, and it appeared like no one had really come up here in a long time.
Oh,
he kind
look
of
at it.
assumed that, the other tenants weren't using this as a storage space. And so the husband was about to go back down the ladder when he noticed off to the right side of the attic, kind of far away from the ladder, right where the roof begins to pitch down, he saw one of the floorboards was kind of popped up, like it shouldn't be. And he stared at it, and he's looking around at the rest of the attic, and all of the floorboards were perfectly uniform, but that one was really jacked up. And so he was curious, and so he climbed up into the attic, and he kind of stooped down
to see
and
what
he
was
walked
up.
over
Why
to this
was that?
floorboard. And when he was standing over it, he could tell that this floorboard had kind of popped off of this hole in the ground, that the floorboard had been covering this hole, but the hole was dark. And so he pulled out his phone, and he turned on his flashlight, and he looked straight down, and he aimed the light into this hole. Now, this hole was basically just a gap between 2 of the walls on the first floor. And so he's shining his light down into this gap, and he sees at the bottom the remains of the woman the Houston police have been looking for the past 2 years, Mary Cerruti. While no one knows for sure exactly what happened to her, It's believed back in early 2015 when she went missing, she had gone up into the attic where perhaps her cats liked to sunbathe off to the side of the attic because there was a big window that looked into the attic. And so she went up there to maybe feed the cats or check on the cats that were up there. And when she walked over to that side of the attic where the window looked in, she stepped on that loose floorboard and it gave out from her weight and she kind of fell through it like a trap door and fell down into that gap between the walls. It's unlikely she was hurt from this fall, but when she stood back up again in this kind of narrow space, she would have realized very quickly that there was nowhere for her to go. You can't go left, you can't go right, and you can't get back up into the attic. It was too far up for her to reach, and there was no way for her to kind of use the walls to climb back up because the space she was in was so narrow. I mean, she could barely move. She also didn't have a cell phone on her, so she couldn't call anyone. If she screamed out, no one would have heard her because she was behind several walls of insulation. And because no one ever checked on her, there was no one that was just going to find her trapped in the wall. She was totally on her own. And so trapped in this little space, Mary spent probably a couple of days screaming and trying to get her way out, but nothing worked. And then eventually she passed away. And then unfortunately, all of her cats did too. Her death was ruled an accident.
Two set of teams came out there to search for her and they didn't find her. You are telling me that nobody got up in the attic? I think that the ladder was down. They went up. What did they do? Did they look with their eyes? You know why? Because I think in the attic, I don't know if she had a window, but maybe it was dark. Did they just look around and were like, well, nothing's here. Let's just go. Honestly, I don't understand what people are doing. Like, what are you doing? Like, they did not find this poor woman because guess what? They didn't look good enough. They didn't look into it enough. They searched the entire house. Literally walked into each room, look around. There's nothing here, nothing here, nothing here. Then they went by their way. Yo, the amount of 0 F's that people give these days, it's kind of heartbreaking. Like, they don't give an F about anybody. Yo, this world is going to hell. If you have enjoyed my reaction, please give it a big thumbs up, comment down below, and subscribe so you can be a part of our community. And I will see you in my next video. Bye-bye.